Just like,
All right.
you know,
Can you hear me okay?
assumed I didn't care for men or something.
Oh,
It was just silly.
You'll hear me okay? All right, good.
Anyway, just craziness.
Well, we'll get started.
They're out
And
there.
you should have the new handout, right? The new one. We're going to start there in a little bit. It's right there at the end of the table. That's from 2 weeks ago.
yeah.
Are we on?
We are on. Yes, ma'am, ready to go. Just remind you what we're doing. We're talking about God's existence, evidence for Christianity.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going to cover.
the magic four.
I'm
That's
glad he
right.
exists.
That's right. That exists. That's right.
You know what? It's holiday week. I suppose a lot of people are going, planning, doing what? Where are they?
There might be. I know some are still coming. They're probably just
Okay.
late, but we need because we got so much ground to cover that we'll keep
Okay.
going. Don't forget the big picture. Just remind you, just for like 2-3 minutes. When someone asks you why you're Christian, I'm hoping you say more than just, "Oh no," you know. So we're thinking of ways to think about how to say it. And when some people answer that question, they say, "I just know that I know, and I'm done." You can say that. Personally, I can't. I like to say, well, I think there's evidence that God exists. I think there's good reasons to think He exists. And because of that, I explain it. Now, I usually say it very quickly and shortly. If they want a lot more reasons, I unpack it, or I teach a whole class. But in general, what I've been trying to say is, it seems to me there are two kinds of evidences. So, give me evidence for God right now. Well, what kind of evidence do you need? There's historical evidence, archaeological evidence, and testimony, and on and on. And two major categories: circumstantial. Those are clues that point to something. And then there's direct evidence. I have clues that my wife exists. Circumstantial. I have direct evidence. I know the woman. And so you put these two things together, I think it makes it very, very, very likely. I think it's exactly like that for the true claims of Christianity. What we've been talking about so far are circumstantial evidences. These are things or clues. And so I've got 10 reasons, and I'm on page 6, the very back of the first handout I gave you. And we're on number 8. So I've been going through clues, or here's just things I think make it very probable, or quite probable, that God exists. And once again, I don't think these things prove it, like someone's going to hear this reason and go, "Ha, you got me, now I get it." Some people might. Some people do. I don't. For me, it's cumulative. Like when I do all these things together, it just makes it more likely than not. And that's why I call it quite probable. So hopefully that rings a bell to you, what we've been doing so far. A little bit? Good. So I'm going to jump in there. We ended last time on objective moral values, number 7, if I recall correctly. So here's a handout right here on the end of the table. If y'all want to get Sierra those two handouts, both of them, take both of them. On page 6. Page 6 of the handout. I think God is the best explanation for why all kinds of things. Just start back at number 5 on the screen, why the universe is rational and comports to mathematics. We keep discovering that it just fits perfectly. I think God's the best explanation for that. I think before there was a universe, there was a mind. Mind created matter. Matter didn't create a mind. I think that best explains it. And then
I was watching something on Nova the other night, and they had a mathematician that said that he thought mathematics and getting really deep into mathematics was like reading God's mind.
So a guy on Nova said, "If I can read mathematics like reading God's mind." Yeah, that's good. In philosophy, that's called conceptualism. And I agree with that view, actually. My view is that, and that's good for him, or her, whoever the scientist was.
I know, I'm not sure he was a Christian, but that's just...
So that's a good way to, I think it's a good way to say it. I think universe is rational and fits 6. I think that's why there's information in the cell, DNA. Information always comes from a mind. Information always comes from a mind. It doesn't come from stuff. If I look at a book on the table, and I would never in a million years think evolution gave me a book. It can give me, I'm being hypothetical, ink, but it's not going to give me information. Information comes from a mind. I think God's this explanation. Number 7, I think there are such things as objective moral values. Objective means something like universal. That is, across, there's really a human race, but across all continents, forever as far as we can tell, there's been this general sense that we ought to do the right thing. And everybody assumes it, no matter your culture. And secondly, they feel like they ought to do the right thing. That is not an is, it's an ought. Where does this commandment come from? You ought to do that. You should do it. We don't feel that, the laws of gravity. We don't feel that in logic. We don't feel that with mathematics. But with morality, we do, on the inside. And I think the reason why it's across culture, besides people with serious psychological disorders, but for the rest of us, and then why is it an ought? I think God's the best explanation. I think we get that from God's character. So I explained all that. I did a whole study on morality. You can go back and listen to that if you want. So that's quick review. Number 8, I think God is the best explanation for why consciousness exists. There was a man named Thomas Nagel, and he's one of the most well-known atheist philosophers, and he came up with an essay years ago called, "What is it like to be a bat?" And but what was real important was, and it's what is it like to be a bat, was that there is a what it is like sense. What is it like to be? And he goes on to talk about how the mental state is that way. When you and I'll say I, when I'm in a conscious mental state, there's something it is like for me to be in the subjective or first poison, because I'm from New York. Every once in a while it comes out. So we're from Mississippi. From the subjective first person point of view, it's like that. There's something about being in a first person subjective point of view that it's a way of talking about consciousness, and that's philosophers and scientists aren't sure exactly how to define consciousness, but there's some commonalities. But that's the first thing we got to get. When we talk about someone who's aware, like right now I'm talking to you, you are not just aware, you are self-aware. You're aware that you're aware. You are aware that you're conscious.
It's kind of like being in the driver's seat of your body.
Being in the driver's seat of your body, very good. Being in the driver's seat of your body. Or of your awareness. Yeah, you're aware that you're aware. You're in the driver's seat. And that's one of the most pivotal, 1974, so that was 100 years ago. But that was a very, very important essay. Then he wrote a book in 2012 called Mind and Cosmos. And this is a big deal because he's an atheist. And he's a well-known, very, very respected philosopher. In Mind and Cosmos, Nagel argues that a materialist view of how life developed, which we talked about already in materialism, that is, everything is matter and energy, and evolution solves everything, basically. He said that ain't going to work. It doesn't work, which is why atheists don't like that book, and materialists don't like the book, in general. Because they say, oh, he didn't, but he gives over on and says, you can't do that. Even if it were possible to map out the exact pattern of brain waves that give rise to a person's momentary complex of awareness, that mapping would only explain the physical correlative experiences, what happens when we are aware, but it wouldn't be them. I can map out on a computer, and that's what they're doing right now. They can go on a computer and start etching out images they think the brain is producing. But that's not the same as the person experiencing it. You see the difference? There's a big difference. A person doesn't experience patterns, and her experiences are as irreducibly real as her brain waves are, but they're different. They're just different. They're different, and everyone knows that about consciousness.
You would have all your physical senses working at the same time as whatever you're taking in with your mind, too.
Right, you have your physical senses, right?
Adding to that.
Adding to it. But what materialists will say is there is no distinction between the brain's experiences and consciousness. They're the same. That's a non-reductionist. A reductionist will say that. I find that completely false, but that is what they'll say. And people like Nagel, who's an atheist, we agree that doesn't explain it. Now, Nagel doesn't like Christian's answer. He just doesn't like it. He even says it. I just don't like it. I don't think that's a good compelling reason not to believe something. But nevertheless, I use him because he's on their side, but still disagrees. So I think we are conscious. I think any argument against consciousness is self-refuting. I had a student one time when I taught at college in Texas for a while, and there's a student who came one time, and we were chatting about this for a moment, and he said he didn't believe in the soul or the mind or consciousness, just the brain, which that's called a physicalist, someone who that's all you are. When it comes to the mind-brain issue, they call them physicalists. I said, so you're a physicalist? He said, yeah. And I said, really? So tell me more. And yeah, I think that's all we are. So how about that? And I asked him a few more questions. He didn't have much more to say besides, I mean, he's like 21 years old. Yeah, absolutely. That's all there is to it. And he's a nice, it was a small summer group, which I like that. So one day we came, this is about a month later or something, he comes into class one time and we were chatting. It's a world religions class. And I said, any question or comments? Somebody goes, yeah, the other day I was thinking to myself. I was thinking, I said, oh, I'm sorry, 1 second. Who was thinking? And he paused and he goes, okay, you got me. Yeah. The point is, in common parlance, I was thinking to myself. There is no I and there's no myself if you're just a brain. There's no you. There's the brain in that body talking to the brain in this body, which is then controlled by the laws of physics. And it becomes, people will say that's how it is, but in my opinion, that's immediately self-refuting because that's not what they really believe. They act as if they have a conscience, and I think that's. And if we're not conscious, then we're not free, which means we do not have moral responsibility. Think about that for a second. So for a choice to be moral means you had the freedom to do otherwise. Well, David, but the brain and the mind consciousness are related. If I had a stroke, I lose the capacity to reason certain ways and speak certain ways. If I get in a car wreck, people change very much. I met a guy just the other day who had a terrible accident years ago, and he doesn't talk right and everything. Absolutely, but they're not identical. They're not identical. It's much more like if I get into a car that's got 4 flat tires and the steering wheel barely turns. There's only so much I can do in that vehicle. But I get into my truck, I can do a whole lot more than that busted up car can do. Well, if you said there's no distinction between the person driving and the car because of the capacity of the car, you made a huge mistake. It's the car. Or another analogy I use is like using a good glove. I use a baseball glove that's all horrible and ruined and got holes in it versus one that's brand new. The hand is limited by the tool it's using. Well, that's how it is with the mind. Very much so. And when in the world to come, in the Christian worldview, we're not going to be limited anymore. So you're like, oh, I'm like Einstein. You'll be a lot better than Einstein. Because when you're not limited by the brain, some of you, maybe all of you, are a whole lot smarter than I am, and I'm glad, because your brain gives you that capacity to be more intelligent, which is a great thing. And some people are less intelligent, and that's a brain issue. It limits the mind's capacity, but that doesn't mean you're not conscious. And remember, one more time, if you're not conscious, then consciousness is an illusion. And there are philosophers who argue that. We think we are conscious, but we're really not. But of course, if consciousness is illusion, then why trust that you think it's illusory? If you're dreaming, why trust that you're in a dream? You see, no matter what it is, at some point you have to believe that you are thinking something, a thought about something, and the aboutness means it's other. But that's what you just said. Oh, there's no other. There's no about other. We're talking about this issue. How is it possible to talk about conscious of the brain if there's no such thing as that? It's just immediately self-refuting, which to me is a good definition of nonsense. And people don't act that way. They make arguments. I've heard debates and watched debates on people who are physicalists versus non-physicalists, and both are debating the truth of the topic, including the person who thinks they're not conscious, and it's just an illusion. Like, wait a second, I want to be a person in the crowd. I'm never in the debate yet. Raise my hand. To whom are you speaking? And why in the world is the brain in that body trying to convince the brain in the other body that other person, that other brain in the body is wrong? If you are nothing but the end result of billions of years of a blind evolutionary process of the universe mixed with millions of years of life on Earth, why trust any of this? And secondly, you can't help but think those things. There's no such thing as right and wrong beliefs. They're forced to have those beliefs. The brain is just being random biochemical reactions in the brain. Why are you trying to defend it? Why even trying to argue? Why write books? Why do lectures? Why not go, hey, I'm forced to believe this because of my blind biochemical reactions in my brain caused by evolutionary impulses. But no one thinks that really because they behave like it's different. Consciousness is not like blinking or breathing or sneezing. C.S. Lewis said just right. Consciousness isn't done to me. I do it. Reason. He says, reason is not done to me. I do it. I reason. So we have different sensations like beliefs or thoughts or agony or fear or sadness or happiness. We have those things. Sure. The brain can be damaged and it limits the mind. Absolutely. Absolutely. But they're not the same thing. Now, that's a huge topic. I think I gave you some books to read. I do. At least one, and you can read other ones if you want, on number 8. So I do think God is the best explanation for why consciousness exists, and I think it exists apart from the brain. Just for speed's sake, are there any questions about that? No questions? All right, I'm going to go ahead. We're almost done. Don't give up.
I don't think this is the one.
This is the one. This is it.
There's another class that I want to start. I just stopped it, but I'm like very confused.
Oh, the
there's another class that I don't know, that a lady told me about that was going to be on
The
Wednesday.
D group on,
Huh?
The Greek counseling?
or the D group on Sundays, the search for significance one.
Yeah, I think that's it.
That's what
Oh,
Sunday
that's
is.
a new
Well,
one.
stick
Yeah.
around. You still learn something. We're almost done with this part.
All right.
This is the most. This is the most abstract. Really. Stay with. We're moving past that.
We
All
have
right.
questions too.
Yeah. Any questions?
Okay.
We're moving past that. So all that to say, it's a big topic, but I think we're conscious. I think consciousness exists, and I think the best explanation is if God did it. He's the best explanation of why we're conscious. 9. I think the soul exists. I think the soul exists. Now, this is also everything's a big topic. This is a real big one as well. And if there is a book you had to read, just one, it would be on your handout. J.P. Moreland's book, The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. I think he's done a fantastic job, it's there in your handout, on explaining what it is and why it matters. I am not going to talk, because of time, I'm not going to explain and define what soul is and so forth into too much detail. But by soul, I mean the immaterial substance of a person. The immaterial substance of a person, which has various faculties. We have various capacities and various faculties. And immaterial, I don't think the soul, Christianity is historically taught the soul is not made of stuff. It's immaterial, but it is real. And that's why I like the distinction, immaterial substance. It is a real thing, but not made of matter and energy.
The immaterial substance that
Of a person.
of
Of a person, which possesses various faculties.
I was just going to say,
Or capacities, whatever word you want to use.
if it wasn't real, why would there be these inner struggles?
Yeah, if
No.
it weren't real, why have these inner struggles? A materialist would say it's because of various biochemical impulses in your brain. I don't find that convincing, but that's what they would probably say.
which possesses what?
Various faculties.
Various faculties.
That
Okay.
is, I have the fact, and there's, he will break it all down. The faculties and capacities are actually different, but I'll use faculties. I have the ability to reason, and there's a word for that we use, mind. The soul can reason. That faculty is called the mind. The soul has the capacity to relate to God. There's a word for that, spirit.
Spirit.
And also it's used for the concept of the soul, which is alive, like the life force. We also use spirit like that, and on and on. And he does a great job. Well, I want to give 2 quick videos that demonstrate, I think, evidence of the soul. So I do think the soul exists for a few reasons, but what I'm going to do just for speed, because you can read all these books you want, just for speed, one of the main reasons I think the soul exists is because I'm convinced we have scientific evidence that it exists. And I think that comes from what's called NDEs, near-death experiences. And many people, I'm going to say it better, most people in my experience have never studied this at all. What they've heard is stories or watched movies where there's like, I saw a white light and then I don't go to the light kind of stuff. But in real NDE experiences, in research, it's a field. It's not that large of a field, but it is a field where scientists really do study it. And it is a fact that people survive past when their hearts and brains stop. It's just a fact. Secondly, it's not only a fact, the experiences are quite similar. Now, they're not unanimous and they're not always the same, but across cultures, they're very, very similar.
And they're usually specific to what was going on.
And thirdly, that usually, not always, usually they gain some kind of knowledge. It's not just experiences like I felt sad, felt happy. They gain knowledge of what occurred in that room or time or period, or in basically that time period, it may or may not be in that room, they gained knowledge that they could not have gained
Otherwise.
If they weren't aware.
if they weren't self-aware. That's exactly right. So it's that knowledge aspect. And there are two books that Jeffrey Long has written. It's also there on your handout. The first one was called Evidence of the Afterlife. If you were slightly open-minded, you'll read that book and be convinced. He's not even a Christian. He gives 9 lines of evidence that the soul exists. Like deaf people can hear, blind people can see, you meet dead relatives, you meet people there's no way you know, I mean, on and on it exists. Then he wrote another book called God in the Afterlife, which is a lot more stories in it. And so it's great, yeah.
I read Heaven is for Real.
Heaven is for Real is a good book. It's very limited.
It is.
Yeah, that's
So
right, which is
that's
fine.
all I needed.
But God in the Afterlife is
Yeah.
like that a lot more.
Well, that was child perspective, right?
Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of
Which is a better
statistics
perspective, I
in
guess.
God in the Afterlife and I got to where I just started skipping over the statistics part because he was trying to show that he was being as scientific as possible. I wanted to get to the stories. But here are 2 different quick news clips that talk about what I'm saying right now.
Question that humanity has wrestled with throughout history.
So,
But a
is
new
there life
study
after death?
conducted by NYU may have found some answers. Dr. Sam Parnia is the Director of Critical Care and Resuscitation Research at NYU Langone School of Medicine, where he ran this study. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Parnia.
Pleasure. Thanks for
So,
having me.
what would you say, what actually happens when you're clinically dead?
You know, when people die, essentially it's when the heart stops. So this has been going on for as far as we know, millennia or longer. And when the heart stops, you stop breathing and your brain shuts down, and that's how we declare people dead. And that's where we give a time of death and we give them a note. And really, to be honest with you, until about 50 years ago, that was the point of death. So people become lifeless, motionless, the brain shuts down. But now through advances in medicine, we can actually bring people back to life, even after they've gone beyond that threshold of death, and study what happens to them. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that the brain completely shuts down, as I said. But what's fascinating is that the cells inside the body, and particularly the cells inside the brain, do not suddenly become annihilated. They go through a process of decay that can take a few hours, which is why we can actually medically bring people back to life after they have technically gone beyond that threshold of death for tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards. And that, of course, raises many interesting questions about what happens when we die.
So tell me more about this study. How did you conduct it? And tell me about, how you came about reaching your findings, your conclusion.
No, I'm an intensive care doctor, so my job is to essentially save people's lives and prevent them from dying. But unfortunately, people do die, and we try to revive them. What we have found is that over the last few decades, many millions of people have now come back, and many of them have reported, actually, anecdotally, that they've been able to see and hear things going on, even though from our perspective, they should have been dead, and their brain should not be functioning at all. And so we became intrigued to study this, 1, because it was fascinating, and 2, because we try to revive people without brain damage and to ensure they don't have any disorders of consciousness, so not becoming like brain damage or having a vegetative state. At any rate, so this particular study is the largest study ever carried out in the world. It was done in 15 medical centers across the US and in Europe, and we studied more than 2,000 people who'd gone through this cardiac arrest or process of death. And we did not expect people to have any consciousness or awareness, but intriguingly, up to 40% of people came back and had a perception of being aware of what was happening to them, even though they had technically gone beyond the threshold of death.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot to it. I should also add that among that group, 10% had a very deep, profound mystical experience that was very true to them. But interestingly, 2% actually had full awareness, could describe all the events that were going on that were validated. So of course the question is, why does that happen? And we don't have the answers, because to our scientific model, when people have died, there should be no more conscious awareness going on. But it sounds like maybe consciousness is able to continue. And by that, I don't mean that they're awake, but that entity that makes us who we are, makes Sam who he is, makes Rena who she is, the self, the mind, seems to continue and doesn't become annihilated after a person has gone through their process of death.
Were there any of the people that you studied that completely lost all consciousness?
Well, that's what I was trying to explain. Everybody loses consciousness immediately as soon as the heart stops. It's not like they're awake and watching us.
You mentioned that there were some people who remembered there was some sort of mystical experience that they were going through. Were there some people who said, nope, didn't feel anything, didn't?
So some people don't have any recollections. What we don't know is whether they had experiences and forgot it afterwards, and that may be what's happening. Because of course we forget a lot of things, and most of the people who are brought back have issues to do with their treatments. We give them sedative drugs, which wipes out their memories. So that's part of what we're studying now, is does everybody have this experience, and how long does mind and consciousness continue in some format, even though we've gone beyond the threshold of death?
Do you have some sort of conclusion as to how far the mind and consciousness goes?
Again, from what we can determine, which is actually fascinating, and it raises questions about our whole science, about what happens when we die, is that it appears that even though people have gone beyond that threshold of death and their brain has shut down, that entity that we call consciousness, the mind, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, does not seem to become annihilated. From the evidence we have, at least tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards. How long beyond that, we don't know at this point.
For the folks who have lost consciousness and come back, have there been any long-term effects afterwards?
Well, those people who have these very deep, profound, mystical experiences, often they describe a sensation of being very peaceful, seeing a bright, warm, welcoming light, sometimes deceased relatives. And intriguingly, some of them describe a sensation of a being that they describe as being perfect and full of light and love and compassion. Those who have that experience are often very positively transformed for the rest of their lives. It's very profound, it's real to them. They become less afraid of death, they lose their fear of death completely, they engage in altruism, they're more helpful to people, they engage more with family. It completely changes them. So there's something very profound about this experience that they have.
We often hear people say, I saw the light, some sort of light. Why do you think it is that some people see that and some people don't?
Well, so there are two possibilities. One is that, as you said, only some people see it, and we think that it might be 10%. But the alternative is that everyone sees it, but unfortunately, because of the medical treatments that they get afterwards in the intensive care unit by doctors such as myself, to save their brain, they forget it. And one of our new studies is trying to actually decipher whether people have had it but just forgot about it. And so I think there is some evidence that more people are having it, but unfortunately they just forget it afterwards.
It's a fascinating study and a fascinating look into death and those final moments as well, and we're turning back. Dr. Samponia.
Now here's Dr. Jeffrey Long, the guy I was talking about in the books.
Do you believe in life after death? One man says he has scientific proof it is true. Dr. Jeffrey Long, a radiation oncologist from Louisiana, has written a book with his findings, calls it Evidence of the Afterlife. Mary Jo Rapini says that she had a near-death experience that profoundly changed her life, and her story is featured in the doctor's book. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Doctor, I can start with you. You collected more than 1,000 stories of near-death experiences from people all around the world, and you say the consistencies in those stories help prove scientifically that there is an afterlife. So based on your data, what is the proof?
Well, my research reveals 9 lines of evidence about the reality of near-death experiences and their consistent message of an afterlife.
Can you give me an example of some of those 9 lines of evidence?
Well, one good line of evidence is that those that are blind, including blind from birth, can have visual near-death experiences, not as fragments, but as fully visual impressions during their near-death experiences, just like visual impressions during other near-death experiences.
And no matter what the age of the person, it doesn't matter, the experience is the same, essentially?
My research involved a study of young children age 5 and under, and I found the content of their near-death experiences absolutely identical to older children and adults, suggesting that whether you know about near-death experiences, what your cultural upbringing is, what your awareness of death is, doesn't seem to have any effect on the content of the near-death experience.
Well, Mary Jo, you claim that you had a near-death experience.
Yes.
You suffered an aneurysm at a gym. When was this?
It was in April '03.
And you were taken to the hospital, and what happened?
Well, for 3 days they couldn't locate the aneurysm, so basically they put me in an ICU and were just monitoring me. And then one night, the third night I got very ill. And I remember they were all of a sudden rushing around me and inserting things into me and monitors. And they called my husband, and he was there, and I looked up and I saw this light. It wasn't a normal light, it was different, it was a luminescent, and it grew. I kept looking at it like, what is that? And then it grew large and I went into it. And I went through this tunnel and I came into this room that was just beautiful. And God held me. He called me by name and he told me, he said, Mary Jo, you can't stay.
And I understand you wanted to stay.
I wanted to stay. I protested. I said, I can't stay. Why not? And I started talking about all the reasons. I was a good wife. I was a good mother. I did 24-hour care with cancer patients. And he said, let me ask you one thing. Have you ever loved another the way you've been loved here? And I said, no, it's impossible. I'm a human. And then it just held me, and it said, you can do better.
Were you a skeptic before this about
Yes.
this? You were?
Yes, I was working with cancer patients prior to this happening. I was getting ready to move to Houston. I was probably at the lowest point in any faith. I had seen terrible things in that cancer center, people dying, and when I would go in and they would tell me they saw things, I would respond. I would just sit there, and they would say, can you see them? And I'd say, no, I can't see them. Then I would leave the room and tell the resident, you better check their morphine level.
Doctor, let me ask you, because I totally respect what you're saying, Mary Jo, and I don't doubt that you experienced what you said you did, but there is such a thing as a sort of cultural conditioning. We've all at this point heard the story about you go through the tunnel, there's the light, you meet God or whatever you want to call that force, and you're told that it's not your time. So how do you know that Mary Jo wasn't just kind of experiencing that? Maybe she was on certain drugs in the hospital?
Well, out of 1,300 near-death experiences that I've studied, Mary Jo's experience is absolutely typical of what people describe. I think if near-death experiences were culturally determined, then people that had never heard of near-death experiences would have a different experience. But we're not finding that. Whether you know or don't know about near-death experience, the time it happens has no effect on whether the experience happens or not, or what the content is.
All right, Doctor, I appreciate it very much, Mary Jo, as well, for your time. Pretty controversial book. It's going to get a lot of people talking.
I'll say very, very quickly, that's one of many, 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 many stories like that in the book. And whether or not you are convinced of all the experiences are true or not, what I find overwhelmingly compelling is that it happened. Something occurred. And that's the way they're trying to get at. Yeah, you might be conditioned for that, but they found that across cultures, across languages, atheists, Christians, Jews, Muslims, they're not the same experience, but they're enormous amount of similar experiences. What strikes me, here's a person, a lot of things strike about her story. Here's a person who really doesn't believe anything. She shows up, meets a being who tells her to do better. She doesn't experience karma or some nirvana. I just became one with everything. And she meets a being who says, nope, go do better. Of all the things, it wasn't like, I love you, go be rich or something. It was a challenge, which is striking. The book tells all kinds of stories. You can do with them if you want, but stories of a woman who was shot by her boyfriend in a fight, and he shot her, and she goes out of her body immediately. She sees all the experience. It's very, very common, and she said this, to meet beings, and they'll right away say, these beings are with me. Some call them angels, some don't know what to call them. They'll say they're beings. They don't talk to me, but I know they're friendly. I know they're there to help me. I just know it instinctively. So we don't really talk because we don't need to, and I wait. And they'll go on and on. They'll have knowledge. One woman died. She was in the hospital, she's an older woman, and when she died in the hospital, she floated her bed and saw some other things, and she thought, I wonder what they're doing at church. It was a Sunday morning. She was in church immediately, and she was behind the pastor as he preached and saw the text he used, listened to the hymns they sang. Later on, she came back to her body and was revived. The pastor visited after church service and was talking about stuff, and she told us some experience, and he goes, wow, well, we missed you at church. We had a good sermon, whatever, or service. And he goes, yeah, I know. He goes, well, yeah, you preach and blah, 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 and you underline and highlight these verses. He opened his Bible, everything was underlined just as she said. She goes, yeah, you sang these hymns? And he was going, yeah, we did. And she goes, I was there, I'm telling you. And that's a common experience, that when they think of something, they're there instantaneously, that time doesn't really matter at all. They have awareness all around them because there's no limitation of the eyeballs. She said, they all say, but you focus like this direction, but you have full awareness. You don't have tons of questions. You feel overwhelming joy and peace and love. It's a very, very common. Some come up with certain abilities. They feel this sense of seeing other things. One woman had died and come back, and she was on her phone with, I think, her best girlfriend, a woman friend. They were chatting on the phone, and she said all of a sudden she saw bubbles everywhere. She was in the living room. She saw bubbles everywhere. She said, I know this sounds crazy. Bubbles just filled the room, and then yellow came in front of her face, like somebody got a yellow piece of paper and just put in front of her eyes. And she said, I felt compelled, like someone was saying, say yellow bubbles. So she interrupted her friend's story. She goes, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know this sounds crazy. Yellow bubbles, does that mean anything at all to you? And the woman starts weeping and laughing. Her husband died about a year before, and they had watched a movie, and in the movie, this person comes from the other side and talks to whatever. And they were having a little date night on the couch, and she said, my husband said, we were talking about it, they said, we ought to come up with something that would be our own code word, so if this ever happened, we would know it was you. And she said, what do you want? She said, what do you want yours to be? Yellow bubbles, is what he said. And so these stories happen time after time after time. The one story of a woman who left, floated her body. She was aware of the surgery, went up, I think it was a she, went up to the 4th or 6th floor outside the hospital and floated outside, or floated, but they have awareness out there. Saw a shoe with a shoestring dangling off, all this stuff. Came and saw all this stuff. Came back to her body, explained everything in detail. The shoe was up there, the shoelace. A story of a guy who died and then leaves his body immediately, and he sees them try to revive. There's a light. He doesn't want to go. He's kind of floating around. And all the nurses, or several nurses, get together and hold hands and pray for him as he had died. They called and everything. Well, it was a long time because he comes back to his body, and he's overlooking, and they're praying, and he recounts everything that's occurred. And these stories, and you notice she said, I worked in ICU in these cancer, and people say, do you see them? And my wife's best friend is a nurse, and I've talked to other nurses, and that is routine amongst nurses. Ask a nurse, have people talk to you about seeing dead relatives or angelic beings? They will have stories for you. It is routine in hospitals to say, they'll start laughing or see him. Do you see him right there? Elaine's grandmother, right before she died, she looked up and put her arms up and started laughing, and then put her arms down and died. This story this goes on forever. So the usual rebuttal is, well, white lights. And my opinion is they've not read carefully. You need to read the material and see whether you find it convincing. And I think there's a soul. I think and I appreciate the first scientist who said, we don't have an explanation. The answer is, of course not, because science has reached its limits. Right? Science deals with matter and energy, and once it's stopped, you can't say anymore. The answer is, we don't have a clue. We can't test it. We can't put it in a laboratory. We can test the results of biochemical changes in the body, but we can't give any explanation for what happens after death. You have to go to other people. That's called metaphysics. And I'm going. I don't want to. We'll get bogged down, but you got to read it. If you like that, read the books and then go for it. But I could give you more stories. Maybe if we have more time, I'll tell you some more fun stories. But there's tons of them. I think the soul exists. I think God's the best explanation of why there's a soul. I think, number 9, I forgot to say it in the soul. I think the idea that pure evolutionary processes, material, matter and energy, can produce something that is not made of matter and energy is absolutely false or absurd. That is to say, it's called a category error. It's a different kind of thing altogether. Just like non-rational processes can't produce a mind, material stuff can't produce an immaterial thing. Mm-hmm. At least that's my view. I'm convinced of that, but others would disagree, but I don't find that compelling. The last thing is this, and this is real short and sweet, but why do humans appreciate beauty? Any evolutionary biologist will tell you there's no evolutionary benefit. Whatever your view of evolution is, there's no benefit for looking at a sunset and going, that is beautiful. You line up 1,000 people, and if they can see, the odds are very high. 998 of them are going to say, yeah, that's beautiful. In other words, I appreciate the beauty. Now, it depends on you might look at artwork differently and so forth, but most people appreciate beauty when they see it, whether it be a human form, sunsets, whatever, but there's no survival benefit to it. And it also includes what we can hear. One argument goes like this: Bach exists, therefore God exists. Mm-hmm. Some people come to the faith because of that. That is, you're enraptured by it, and you're overwhelmed by it. And if you ever felt that before, it feels almost out of body. There's a surreal, visceral experience that can come along, and I believe the reason why humans have those experiences when there's no survival instinct, there's nothing that taught. I don't teach my kids to appreciate that. Humans appreciate beauty. Now, if I go to Asians or Antarcticans and whatever, we have little fine teeth. I get it, they're details. But nevertheless, we appreciate beauty. And I think God's the best explanation. I think there's no materialistic, naturalistic explanation. That's all I'm going to say about that, but I do think we appreciate beauty and God explains it. There's my first 10 reasons that make it quite probable God's the best explanation. I don't put all my faith in these things. David, what if a scientist one day nails it, and this is why there's information in the cell? I go, okay, that's cool. I don't think it's going to happen. If it does, all right. My faith is not in number 6. I'm not a Christian because of number 6. I'm not a Christian because of number 5. Does that make sense? My faith is not in these things. Scientific inquiry can change. We can discover things. That's awesome. I think these 10 things are 10 things that are of a kind that science will not ever be able to explain. So it's not just this God of the gaps, like, well, we're trying to figure out how physics works. I think these are the kinds of things that science cannot ever do. If I'm wrong, okay. But I'm not a Christian because of these 10 things. But I think these 10 things are clues that point. Does that make sense? Right? That's that circumstantial evidence. I think they're clues. Very clues. All right. I'm going to move ahead. Are there any questions about the first 10? If not, I'll move on pretty quickly. Any questions? Okay, now we're moving on to what I call very probable. Very probable, which is, you should have page, whatever your handout is now. It's page 7? Good, because I don't have your handout, I have my master note. The very probable. Now, that's the way I talk about it. To me, it was quite probable the first 10. Now we're going to the very probable. I think these get real good. And external and internal data. You don't have to memorize all this, but if I asked most scholars, historically speaking, most scholars in the field, now you can make up your own mind, right? Spencer, you're your own jury, and Lily was and St. John is his own jurist. Y'all can make up your own mind. So when I use the word scholar, it does not mean therefore it's true. But I do listen to scholars in any field. I listen. They've spent a lifetime. There's some brilliant women and men. I listen very carefully, and that means something to me. So all that to say, if you want to be curious, when scholars ask the question, did it really happen? Most scholars in the field are convinced when, for example, and this I think should make sense to you, content and literature, there's an internal, the content of it is comported, that is, it jives with archaeological evidence. So if you have literature that says it happened, and you have archaeological evidence that says, there's my proof it did, that's almost certainly considered fact. So when you have literature and a thing, a rock, an inscription. If our literature says Caesar existed and he defeated his enemies and we built a statue in this date, and then I find the statue with those exact words with the date on it, any historian goes, it happened. There's no, well, it all could be a fantasy. It could be a conspiracy. It's possible. But most historians go, well, I'm going to take that very seriously. You've got literature and stuff. Now, the problem is, the problem for me, is dialogue is almost never confirmed. So if it said, Emperor Claudius in the 40s talked to his general and said, I need you to go buy me some hot dogs because I'm really hungry. You're almost never going to find that on an inscription somewhere. So no matter what, dialogue is almost never. That includes the Gospels. In anything in the Old Testament, anything historical, anything, you're hard-pressed to find dialogue that fits archaeological data. But if you find content and it's comported by archaeological, the second thing is there is obvious archaeological evidence. So you have internal and external. Number 2 is when you only have external. I found a rock that's 2,000 years old, and its inscription, it says Tacitus beat the Jews, and this really happened, by the way, Titus and Vespasian, they destroyed the temple in AD 70, and they go back to Rome, and they built a big curvy bridge, you might say, under which they walk. It's still there if you go there today, and on it is beautiful and amazing to me. They have etched in the stone a whole scene of the Romans with their loot from the Jerusalem temple. And you can see they're holding a menorah. And it's amazing. Well, they could have been lying, but probably not. Most historians go, that's clear, hardcore archaeological evidence that some event happened that they're celebrating. Go back to number 1. We find the literature that it happened. Josephus talks about the sack of the temple. We've got Titus's arch. Thank you very much. That confirms it. That's 1 and 2. But let's say he just had archaeological evidence. Does that make sense? If I found a spoon, someone mowed a spoon, an alien did. Okay, those are silly stories. So that's what happens. 3, I'm going by like most probable happened. Number 3, there's content literature that's widespread geographically in different authors, and it doesn't seem to fit a heavy bias or agenda. That seems to be the case. For example, Josephus, who's a Jewish author, and the Gospels talk about Galilee. Well, if they both talk about it, it's likely that they're both telling the truth. Josephus is not a Christian. They don't seem to have an agenda to talk about the Galilee in a certain way. Does that make sense? So if it's widespread, or the Pharisees, if we have different evidence in the Gospels and in Josephus and other literature about the Pharisees, well, that means they're probably telling the truth. The group of Pharisees really existed. For example, in the Old Testament, multiple different sources of literature talk about a great flood. Now, the Bible calls it Noah's flood, but other cultures don't say it's Noah, it's other people. Well, they don't seem to have an agenda. They have different points they make, but it seems like some kind of big flood happened. Unless they're all mistaken or all lying, which is possible, but most scholars don't find it convincing. They will probably a big flood happened. And that's why it shows up in a bunch of different cultures. 4, content literature that is widespread, but it does demonstrate heavy bias. So it's less likely, but it probably happened. But maybe a bunch of different Roman authors talk about this Roman emperor who's so awesome. Well, they might have a little bone to pick, but it's widespread. And then 5, purported eyewitness testimony. Yes, it's down here. Because eyewitnesses are always biased to some degree, and you have to sort through biases no matter what. And then 6, content literature assumes or asserts a supernatural cause. Any historian will put this at the bottom of the list every time. Every time. So the more it is not supernatural, the better off it is. The second it's a miracle of any kind that we call a miracle, it's down there. So does that make sense to you? You can make up your own mind. I'm just telling you that's what most scholars do. Most scholars. If I put this all together, this is David because I'm doing the presentation, and I can give you all these notes later if you haven't written them. If you want to write them down, I'll give it to them. But I'm going to move ahead very quickly. When I think about it, when someone says, David, what makes you think something happened? Well, I think in 2 things, which I just did. Is there external and internal evidence? That's it. Is there sufficient external evidence? Are there manuscripts, like handwritten papyrus or something? Are there archaeological evidence? Things I could touch from the time period. An ancient feather, an ancient chemistry. Is there an ancient something? And 2, is there internal evidence? Do the events comport to what we know of the time period? Events, places, people are corroborated. That is, it fits what we know about the time. It fits. So this rules out comic books. This is a very common thing I get online. Well, it's pretty common with atheists. Well, I'm glad you're in the Gospels. I also believe in the Lord of the Rings. What's the difference? What's the difference between Harry Potter and the Gospels? Yes, that's a common retort. To which I say, good question. The difference is history. That's the difference. There are no events, places, or people that corroborate in Harry Potter. They're made up. And historical fictions are things like, one guy on Facebook a long time ago asked me this question. Yeah, David, what about the comic books? They'll have Captain America. There really was a World War II. And they'll have Hitler and stuff. I go, that's right. Then the question is, do those events and places people corroborated, do they also fit external evidence? The answer is no, not Captain America. The events around him are. The second thing I'd say is, Jews didn't write historical fictions. They wrote novels. The novels almost always had to do with romance. So you would have to demonstrate that the Gospels are a kind of historical fiction. And I don't know of any New Testament specialist who thinks that. Atheist, Jewish, Christian, no one thinks that. So for me, I like both. And I'm consistent on this issue, as best as I can be, of any religion. So David, why aren't you a Buddhist? I'm looking for external evidence and internal evidence. Why aren't you a Muslim? I'm looking. If I weren't a Christian, would I be a Jew? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Because of these 2 criteria I look at all the time. There's a whole lot more external evidence for Christianity than there is a New Testament than there's the Old Testament. I'll tell you right now. There just is. But now again, there's a whole lot of work to be done in archaeology. But in Christianity, fine. What if I picked out Mormonism? Not picked on Mormonism. What if I was in Mormonism? I'm not a Mormon for these exact two reasons. And here's a quote from a guy who was considered one of the leading American archaeologists of the 20th century. His name was Michael Coe. He said this, this is my quote from 1973, but it still fits today based on specialists I know of. Dr. Coe said, "Let me now state uncategorically that as far as I know, there is not one professionally trained archaeologist who's not a Mormon who sees any scientific justification for believing that the Book of Mormon's statements concerning archaeology to be true. And I would like to state that there are quite a few Mormon archaeologists who join this group." This is in spite of a host of well-intentioned books and articles by Mormon intellectuals trying to justify these claims. Let me say it a different way if you don't know this. Most Mormons argue that the Mayans and the Aztecs and Mesoamericans, they are this lost tribe of Israel that they believe happened because Joseph Smith, who I'm convinced made up a story from fiction error, of these two lost tribes of Israel that left Israel and made it to North America and had these big battles. And there was chickens and horses and whatever. Well, there's zero archaeological evidence of these chickens and horses and anything like that in North America before the Spaniards brought them. Centuries later. So there is zero archaeological evidence for those. There is zero external or internal evidence of these lost tribes of Israel. They show up in no other literature or inscription in the world. Joseph Smith said they wrote, and his golden tablets were in what's called Reformed hieroglyphics. There is no, we call it Reformed Egyptian. Reformed Egyptian. There is no record of this Reformed Egyptian anywhere in the world. Now, some Mormon specialists will say, yeah, that's what the ancient Mayans used. But when you look with what Joseph Smith said about the letters, no, they're not. So they try to make that work. So you have external things like there is no archaeological evidence for these major, these aren't little things, like tribes existed, these civilizations they built in North America, zero evidence. And then internal evidence like there was no existence of horses, elephants, chariots. None of these things are corroborated. I find it very problematic to find something convincing. And I'm not picking it like, well, okay, horses. Okay, maybe you got that wrong. The entire point of the tribes, you ought to read the Book of Mormon, all of that is not corroborated anywhere. That's like saying we have no historical corroboration whatsoever of Galilee or Capernaum or of Jesus and the disciples ever existing. That's not like a minor point. That's the point, right? That's a biggie. And that's the stuff. So all I'm saying is when I look at stuff, I look at these two things across religions. And in my view, I think Christianity makes the best sense of that. So using that same external, like manuscripts, things, stuff that I can touch, I'm going to start with external data, and then I'm going to go to internal data. We won't get to internal tonight, I bet, because that's when we're talking about the Gospels themselves, inside the stories, like does it sound like eyewitness testimony and so forth. I'm going to start on the external data. Now I'm going to go a little fast. If you want more reading, you can read all you want on the handouts, okay? Does that make sense so far? Are you with me? Sierra, are you tracking?
Yeah, I'm good.
Because I know you're jumping around. You did a good job. All that more abstract stuff and scientific, that's behind us. Unless you want to ask questions later. But we're going to start using things you might be a little more familiar with. Except for this very next thing. Okay. This very next thing. Okay, if you're not familiar with manuscript just literally, I don't need to write on the board. Manuscript comes from Latin words, manus and scriptura. It means handwritten. That's all it means. A manuscript means handwritten. Anything that's handwritten is called a manuscript. And the most popular form of substance that ancient people of the time of the Gospels wrote on were called papyrus. That's where we get the word paper. When I look, I should have said this first because maybe you don't know this. Just in case you don't know this, here's your Bible. Is that okay? I don't care what it is. Good. So, for example, when I pick up, this is probably the NR. So this is the Protestant Bible, which means there are going to be 66 books inside of it. I'm assuming, versus the Catholic. Because it's on it. So the Protestant canon has 66 books in it. The Roman Catholics have a different one. Orthodox have more. Orthodox Christians have more. Ethiopic Christians have even more. They have more books. We only have 66. Every time someone says, I believe in the Bible, you should ask which one. Because we have the fewest at 66 books, right? So, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. This is nice is English translation put by an editorial team who want to make money and spread the word of Jesus, but they also want to make some cash. That's why there's billions of editions of Bibles and translations and pretty pictures and fun covers and all that stuff, which is cool. Beneath this text, you might say, where does this come from? Where did they get this? It's not from scholar heaven. It didn't just fall from the sky. What happened is over time, the last couple thousand years, we have discovered ancient papyrus scrolls and some vellum and other materials, primarily papyrus, upon which the New Testament, I'm going to stick with that because we're talking about Christianity, okay? I'm not going to talk about in time. I don't have time to go Old Testament, New Testament. I'll always assume New Testament, just for the sake. Behind these texts are papyrus scrolls. I mean, things you can pick up. I almost brought you a version of that. But you can go to Egypt today and buy them. I have one in my home. It's called The Wedding Picture. I got it when I was dating Elaine, and I thought I might marry her, but she might have said no. And it was a risk to me, John, because I had to spend like $30 on this painting. That says David and Elaine in hieroglyphics. But she says, no, I just wasted it. Well, when you're a poor college student, that's a big deal. And so thankfully she said yes.
It is.
But I have a piece of papyrus in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And this is in this classic marriage scene that's the pharaohs used. And see, I'm pagan like that. But anyway, so you can get the papyrus. You can get the things. We have found ancient things, ancient papyrus that looks like that. And then there's tons of them. In fact, I'll talk about a little bit. There are thousands of them, thousands and thousands of them. And what people do are called textual critics. I had a class of PhD on this. People who specialize, they look at all the papyrus sheets. So imagine that, all these sheets are full of papyrus. Let's be hypothetical. And there are 5,000 papyrus sheets all over the room. And we're like, okay, well, which ones are the oldest? Which ones seem more ancient? And there's a whole science to it. There's an art to it, but mainly it's science, a very specific criteria that most of them over which they concur. And in general, most textual critics get the oldest manuscripts. That's kind of common sense. If I found a handwritten copy, because it's handwritten manuscript, a handwritten copy from last year versus I found one that can be dated to the year 100, which one's probably a little more valuable, right? The one from 100, right? That's the point. Well, that's how it works the manuscripts across the time. And so manuscripts are where the Bible comes from, Old and New Testament. And that's where it comes from. So if you saw all the colors of where the manuscripts come from, it would look like a patchwork quilt. If say like P52 were in orange, you would see those, and so forth. And that's a crash course on textual criticism, but not really criticism. But that's where your Bible comes from. It comes from a bunch of old manuscripts. Where are those manuscripts today? They're in libraries mostly, like University of Cambridge, Oxford, some in America, they're Harvard, all over the place, the actual manuscripts themselves. So why trust the Bible? Well, David, what if they just made up the New Testament in the 1960s? A bunch of hippies? I'd say, well, no, because the manuscripts we have come from a lot older than that. Manuscripts are ancient. The ones we have in the New Testament are very, very, very old, written within a short time of the originals. Now, the oldest one, or one of the oldest that on record, is P52. The lowercase p means papyrus. 52 means it was cataloged as number 52. It's a scrap. It's about the size of a credit card and has a portion of John on it. That's it. Now, it's not the whole Gospel of John. That comes later. But the earliest one, if you know what's the most ancient, there's that. Now, recently there were some texts found of Mark and some others that go about the same time period, but they can date it. They can date it by doing a carbon test and so forth. But a fairly accurate way is what's called paleography. These are people who specialize on how language writing changes over time. If you see your old cursive, I guess, do they still learn how to cursive anymore when kids? Well, you're old enough to know cursive.
They don't teach you.
They don't teach you. Well, script. When you write it when you're 4 years old, 6-year-old, if you have children, you see how they change over time. Well, people groups do that. And they've changed how they write Greek and Hebrew, Latin over time. And specialists can spot it, usually within 100 years. That's a long time. But when you're talking about thousands of years, they can get real specific. Some down to the 50s or 20 years. You can get real pretty close. So there's various ways to study it, the material itself, and on and on. So when you look to the manuscripts of the New Testament, they're very old. When you compare it to other ancient sources, think about this. For example, Homer, which is like the ancient person's Bible. Everybody read Homer. Everybody did. And his work, the Iliad, was written around 800 BC. The earliest manuscripts we possess are 400 years after it was written. Let that sink in. So he wrote it, and then a handwritten copy. The first time that we have a copy of it is 400 years after that. Now, the old numbers, don't worry about that. We have about 1,757 copies or fragments. A fragment counts as a copy. It can be this big, that counts. So that's 400-year time gap. Herodotus, who is one of the most well-known historians, we have a 1,350-year time gap of when he wrote it versus what we possess as a copy. Sophocles, about 100, 200 years. Plato, 1,300 years.
Yeah.
Caesar, he wrote his Gallic Wars. He wrote it around 1 BC, 100 BC. We have one in the 9th century. That's almost 1,000 years difference. Livy's Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, 400 years. Thucydides, 200 years. Demosthenes, over 1,100 years. And then the New Testament, about 40.
40 years.
That's some big time gap.
Let that time gap sink in a little bit.
That is something.
And we've got around 5,800 that's under that manuscripts. Again, a piece of fragment counts. If it's different, it counts.
So that's a lot of eyewitness.
A lot of eyewitness. When we get to the internal data, that's right. It makes it much more likely that the copies we possess were written within the time frame of an eyewitness. That's right. When P52 was written, this fragment, it could have been written within the lifetime of an eyewitness of Jesus. Probably not. It probably comes in the time of John the Elder and Polycarp, which is the very generation 2. Generation 2. So, well, David, does that mean I can trust every word it's saying? No. It just means, hold on a second. Because there are people who want to dismiss all of the New Testament because it was written, the copies of the manuscripts are so far removed. First off, no, they're not. 2, if you throw out the New Testament, guess what else you throw out? Everything. We don't know anything about history. Anything if we throw out the New Testament. I mean, look at the number. That's a silly time gap. That's nothing. That's nothing compared to 1,000-year time gap of the copies we possess. Now, 40 years doesn't mean every manuscript we possess is that early. It just means that the earliest ones start there. The Gospels, for example, the whole Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, those whole texts, they come around the year 200 AD. So that puts it about 130 years after they were originally written. About 130 years. So the whole one. And that gets closer to Herodotus. But still, that's better than 1,000 years and 450 years and whatever.
How about the likes of even, say, 50% of one of those Gospels? How?
I have a chart. I'm going to show you in just a second. Kind of. I think it might answer that question. But the one that we use the most for New Testaments come from that 4th century about 200s. Most of them. Bruce Metzger, everyone thinks he's the finest New Testament textual critic of the last century. He died. He was at Princeton for years. You've heard Bart Ehrman? Best-selling Bart Ehrman, who was a Christian, left the faith. Now he writes book after book after book about you can't trust the Bible, misquoted you. He's from Lawrence. That's right, Lawrence.
Oh, really?
He's from Lawrence. Yeah, went to Lawrence High. Bruce Metzger was his mentor, PhD at Princeton. No classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides is in doubt, because the earliest manuscripts of their works, which are of any use to us, are over 1,300 years later than the originals. Of course, every historian who reads Herodotus, the Roman historian, no one goes, we can't trust it. You have to. The earliest copy we got is 1,300 years after the fact. But most Roman historians in the world, they debate it, but most say, yeah, but most of it probably is pretty accurate. There's a basic assumption. And it's true, most Roman historians trust the New Testament much more than most New Testament historians do. They are much more skeptical within the field than outside the field. And here's an example here's the actual absolute distributions. So that number, there's like 5,800. Most of them come from later on. Because by the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, we have monasteries doing formal copying. In the first few centuries, we don't have monasteries. So we have around 4 manuscripts before the 7th century. Now this is a little bit dated, a little bit. But then by the beginning of the 3rd century, that's what I just mentioned a second ago, we got 47 manuscripts, papyrus. Don't worry about the little colors right now. So you see how the numbers get bigger, they'll go on because you start having more formal copying. So the earlier you get back to those actual events, we do have fewer manuscripts because, I mean, they're that much more ancient. And the ones we have are a little more fragmentary because they barely made it hanging on for 2,000 years. But by the time we get to the 2nd, 3rd century, I have a picture in a second. We have some exquisite manuscripts. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just thinking, you get more archaeological discoveries too as you go along, so you find more.
You do get more archaeological discoveries, yep.
You find more of those.
So the first thing that makes it more probable that we can trust that Christianity is true is that the manuscripts are quite old, especially when you compare them to other Roman points and the Greek point. That's my point so far, is that we shouldn't dismiss it. No historian dismisses them. Atheists on YouTube do, but no historian dismisses the manuscripts. They're very, very, very stinking old, and there's a lot of them. They do get more fragmentary the earlier you get, and there are fewer of them, absolutely. Nevertheless, they're still much more earlier than anything else that we possess of other people. Does that make sense? Okay. 2, manuscripts and their translations come from different regions of the empire. And there's a textual word we call families, and I don't have time at all to explain it. And after class, if you want to, I can. From different families of manuscripts. There shouldn't be a hyphen there. I originally had it spelled. So there are 3 major families: Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. 3 major families. If you have manuscripts, Hancock copies, where the words are discovered, Jesus ate the bread and the fish, and it says that in all 3 families, it means all 3 families are based off of something even before that. Because that's where they got it. That takes us all the way back to the 2nd century easily. And most of the New Testament comes back to that. Big chunks of it do. I mean, there's a lot. So, for example, here's all the text families. Alexandrian, early known by about 150. It's shorter. And that's a lot of where your New Testament comes from today, that family of text traditions. The Western, it's longer, it tends to add more. Like the Western version of the book of Acts is like 26% longer than the book you've ever seen. They have a bunch of stuff added. And the Byzantine is even later. But it was the text used for the King James Version. They only use Byzantine text. The King James Version was written in 1611. They only had, if I recall now, like 8 manuscripts. We've got like 5,800. We know a whole lot more about the Bible, Old and New Testament, than they did back then. We just have like Indiana Jones, they keep being discovered over and over again. And those 3. And when you put all this stuff together, you've got manuscripts, you've got versions means translations. Don't forget, that's Greek. 5,800 is just Greek translation. I mean, manuscript, that's just the Greek manuscript, 5,800. When you add Old Latin and Vulgate, Syriac, Coptic, it's tens of thousands.
What sort of age would the Latin Vulgate?
That goes back to about the 4th century and afterward, because Jerome did that in the late 300s, early mid 4th century.
Oh, that early. Okay.
Yeah. And then you have church fathers who quote from the New Testament.
And then don't they, I read someplace that even when they find another very ancient one that's older, it never contradicts what they've got in the later one.
Yeah, I don't know if we find earlier texts, it never contradicts. I have a little point about that. I'm not sure if I would say never contradicts, but in general, that's true. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. That's exactly right. And that's very important what you just said, which is why I have a whole point. I have a whole number, which is number 4, which we're going to do in a second. So very good, Vanna. So if I went to the New Testament and I go, let's say, for example, all the manuscripts in the libraries burned up. They're all gone. And I lost all of our modern Bibles. I can go to the church fathers and reconstruct, I think it's like 96% of the New Testament.
Really?
That's how much they quoted. Yeah, there's, I think, close to 1 million quotes with the church fathers of the New Testament. Now, they're not exact. Most of them work by memory, and memory is good as yours and mine. So, but if you could work backwards, you get really, really close to reconstructing it. If you had just the translations alone, now they're not the earliest, but they come early, within 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Within a few hundred years, it spreads, as you imagine, like wildfire. When the New Testament gets put together and those documents are written, boy, they translated fast and furious, and they go everywhere. Well, we have a lot of them. We have tens of thousands of translations of the Greek. Tens of thousands. And that's just the New Testament. Old Testament's also as well. So you have all these things together. We have a reason to trust it.
Can I tell you a quick story?
Yes. let me say this real quick, and then if you want, or maybe it's a question. Is it a question or just a story?
Well, no, it's about the translating the church fathers and so on.
Okay. It was a quick story. Go ahead.
They just said that I read that if a scribe was translating, and if the Pope walks in, they were supposed to ignore the Pope and keep on with what they were doing, so that they would not make a mistake anywhere. It was that important to them to make sure their manuscripts were always.
Saying if the Pope walked in while someone was copying, keep on typing.
They were instructed to not.
And that's interesting. Now, and that's interesting. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, that'd be kind of cool. In the textual tradition history, that would help us when we get to, say, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th centuries past. But in the earliest centuries, where we really want it to count, that doesn't help us because there is no Pope.
Right.
Does that make, just to be clear, just to be real clear, that in the first few centuries, there's no unified structure. These are copies being done probably by some scribes and specialists, but in different regions, different churches for different reasons. I mean, reasons to copy it. But by the time we get to the later centuries, then they become monasteries set up to do nothing but copy the text. And they're a lot more formal. And we can tell that by the text. Their copying is a lot better because all they do is copy. They're trained to copy. Now, and they write things on the side. They'll write on the side, stormy weather today, I'm sleepy, I'm hungry. You'll find places where they smudge it until they fell asleep. I mean, all kinds of stuff. They can see that. Oh, one quick, 2 very important points here. Because of this, because there are so many different manuscripts and there are different regions spread out, it means there never was an orchestrated attempt by the church to suppress or change the manuscripts. There is no church structure that existed for the first several centuries. The manuscripts were spread out and copied independently. And about every single Easter season or resurrection season, you got the brand new CNN or History Channel and the secret manuscripts and the Roman Catholics and that. The South, we'd say, bless their heart. That didn't happen. It's too widespread, and there is no church structure to force them to copy it at all. It doesn't happen that way. It didn't exist. It just didn't exist. The second thing is various families of texts, like P75, which is the Papyrus 75, it contains major portions of Luke and John, big chunks of them. That's P75. Another big codex called Vaticanus, and it contains almost every book of the Old New Testament. They're very close to each other. But both are dependent upon an earlier manuscript coming from the 2nd century. So when they correlate with Codex Sinaiticus, which is another one, it's especially likely that all of them are based on what's called an archetype. That is, the more they're spread out in different regions, and they agree, like my example earlier, the textual critics, so it had to have been based on an earlier manuscript. And that's what we have in the manuscripts many, many, many times. This other thing is, this is all common. Oh, it's like the telephone game. No, it is not. In British, they call it Chinese whispers. You'll hear that sometime on Chinese whisper, but you're racist. But just kidding. See, in America, we would say that. We call it the telephone game. They call it Chinese whispers. It's the same point. That is, when I love Don's in youth group. You tell them, I like to eat red apples, and it goes around the room, and it ends up, so-and-so likes a horse, or whatever. It's funny. That's not what happened in manuscripts. Manuscripts are written, not spoken. They're written. There are multiple lines of transmission. It's much more like if I, at the table, told you, and 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 then you made copies. It's not 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. And they still have access to the earliest copies to check them. In a telephone game, imagine for a second, I told Mary, and Mary told David, and David told Spencer, and Spencer goes, hold on a second. David, what did you say? You like red apples? I heard red and green. I said, I like red apples. Oh, okay, red apples. So David heard wrong. Corrected. As you go back to me, the telephone game is a bad analogy. It's completely false. Tertullian, who's a church father 180, he said, he was talking about how to defend against false claims about the Gospels. He says, come now, you would indulge a better curiosity if you would apply it to the business of your salvation. Run over to the apostolic churches. He means like in Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read, uttering the voice and representing the face of each of them severely. And so those probably what happened, it's a common scholarly belief, is that, say you're at Corinth, that some kind of early massive, well-known manuscript tradition of the Corinthians stayed in Corinth. And then they would make copies of the Corinthian correspondence, and that's where it went to other places. But the telephone game, that's a bad analogy. In fact, it's much more likely to be true. 4, this goes back to what Vanna's point made a second ago. Earliest fragments that we keep finding, we humans, it corroborates later codices. A codex just is the word for a book. So, for example, the books you have, your Bibles you have there, it's a binding on the edge with pages. That's called a codex. That's the form in which that is. The earliest Christians might have invented it. We don't know for sure they invented it, but they sure made it popular. Almost every single manuscript we possess, you can tell, came from a codex form. Romans did not like that. The Romans preferred the scrolls. And when Romans used codexes, it was almost always used to use instruction on how to write, or it was used for simple things like keeping records of taxes, or the most common was when it was used as a textbook. When it was a textbook on how to do something, it was used in codex form. But for their other narrative literature and biographies and so forth, they scroll, all the way to the 4th century. Christians were different. Christians seemed to prefer the codex almost immediately, and it was almost exclusively what they used. And there's all kinds of theories about why, but nevertheless, it was the earliest. So that's what a codex, codices, is plural. Earliest fragments corroborate later codices. For example, we have a document, here's an example right here. So here on the left side is Codex Vaticanus. It's because it was found in the Vatican in Rome. It was written around the mid-4th century, so let's say mid-300s. Okay, that's a page from it. That's an actual copy of a page there. You see the coloring at the top and all that. It's one of the best preserved collections of the Old and New Testament in the world. It's very valuable. And if you'll notice, just little highlights here, 3 columns. This is very official. This is a very nice piece because it's very orderly. All these measurements are on purpose. They had these, I'll get bogged down, but I like it. Stickoi, they're different, the exact measurements of centimeters. You can tell this is formal. This is a very well done formal document. There's no punctuation. This is all in lowercase and called a minuscule. No? Yeah, that's minuscule. And there's no punctuation, there's no verses, no chapters. That comes centuries later. And we can tell it's a codex because, well, we have it. I mean, it looks like a book. You can turn the pages. Some things are missing, but it's awesome. This is mid-4th century. The Oxyrhynchus is a place in Egypt. They found a huge stash there not too long ago, and the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 1228 is the number of the catalog they gave it. It's of the exact same document. It's the late 3rd century. So this is mid-4th, this is late 3rd. So let's say 50 to 100 years earlier is the fragment. Well, when you compare this fragment to this, guess what? They're almost identical. So what happens is, even though this is fragmentary, this is awesome. This is awesome too. When you read this here, the font is a little different, a little more scribbled. It's not as formal. If you look carefully, I mean, you might say it's all Greek to me, but I can see the difference. They're quite different. This is more informal. See the line you can see from a distance? These lines curve. They curve a little bit. These do not. This was not written by the same kind of specialist. And the earliest fragments we find that get earlier are more like this. You can tell they're more and more not as trained. They're still scribes. They're trained to write. But by this time, when you have monasteries, it's just a lot more formal. It's like they almost went to school for it, you might say. But the point I'm making now is, when we find over time, the last couple of centuries, the more we find these papyrus scraps that are older, they keep corroborating. We don't find these portions that go, what? Jesus was a woman? What? There were 30 disciples called apostles? We don't find that ever. Ever. It almost always lines up word for word. And if it doesn't line up, it's almost always, which I'll talk about, it's a spelling error. It's a spelling error, it's a copy error. It's not content different. Mm-hmm.
How about with those earlier fragments? Do they collaborate on any of the text that is for major doctrinal issues, like Jesus being the Son of God or Jesus being God and such?
So those are called variants. A good example. The variants we're going to talk about, that's number 6. So we are going. That's a very good question, and I'm postponing you, but not pushing you off, because I want to slow down on that one for sure. Let me review this real quickly as we're talking about this. The Oxyrhynchus Papyrus. All those fragments, they demonstrate that scribal tendencies varied. Some seem quite careful, others more careless of how they copied. There's no big differences. Breathing marks and spacing in the earliest fragments demonstrate that the texts were used for public reading. Most scholars think they were liturgical settings because the way they use these earliest, there's a minor breathing marks every once in a while, and there's little pauses written sometimes in the spacing of the lines themselves. And that's, most specialists think that's because it was to help the person read aloud. You read aloud the text, liturgical setting. Which probably explains why Matthew's gospel is much more stable in a copying process than Mark's. Matthew was by far the most popular gospel in the early church, and it became stable very quickly. It became stable because he was used in the church so much for liturgical reasons that they knew it so well they copied it much more better. Mark was used the least, which is sad. I like Mark. Poor Mark, I spent the most time with him. It is highly likely that repeated liturgical usage set the parameters. That makes it set parameters. That is to say, you can't make a manuscript say Jesus had 23 disciples and he was a woman and he really went to Vegas. You can't say that because when the manuscripts were being written, they were written within a church community that heard these texts all the time. So it gave formal parameters to how much they could say. It doesn't mean they copied them perfectly. They did not. They made mistakes. But I'll talk about in a second. Almost all the mistakes are copying it. They're spelling errors. That's it. But the doctrine could not change. And it's probably because of that liturgical settings. We keep finding manuscripts. We humans keep finding them in monasteries, private libraries, caves. Recently, probably first century papyrus documents, first century, were discovered on the inside of mummy masks. The average Egyptian had linen or papyrus used in their burial, and some masks were made of papyrus with scripture on it. So you find an Egyptian tomb and take the mask off, the papyrus they used to wrap around the face was a Bible verse, Bible chapters.
Really?
So we find them all over the place, and they keep being discovered. And that's a big deal. But what the big deal is, not just that they're found, that when they are found, one of the first things we want to discover is, does it fit what we already know? The answer is yes. Yes, it keeps fitting over and over and over, which makes it more likely that the later full, more likely, not certain, more likely that the full treatment got it right. 5, we have some time. I'm going to go as fast as I can. Number 5, whenever there's a big fat gap in a manuscript, it's called a lacunae. What's up, man? It's called a lacunae. Well, we have no major lacunae that exist, except perhaps, you can stick around if you want.
I'll catch the replay.
Except perhaps the ending of Mark. If you don't know this, if you go to Mark chapter 16, verse 9, it says, Jesus, they said, go tell the disciples, it says they did not because they were very afraid. It ends there. Different codices, manuscripts, add endings to that. They don't like the fact that it says, and they left, they were very afraid. And scholars debate, was that the original ending, or was the original ending that was lost? My own view is that it was lost. And if it's lost, that means there is a gap. There's a lacunae. That is in the original manuscript, or one of the earliest copies of it. That means the very, very end of the scroll, that part got ripped off or deteriorated. And so they went to copy it. They copied all they could find. Now, if it was the original ending and it was not a gap, then it's not a gap. That's why I said perhaps. So here's an example. Here's a Dead Sea Scroll. Here's a copy. Here's an example. Dead Sea Scrolls are a phenomenal find for Old Testament studies. Phenomenal. And here's an example of the Isaiah scroll. We found the whole text of Isaiah, which is phenomenal. And, okay, I have to do because of time. This is just amazing. I said I want to talk about the Old Testament, and I'm not going to. Here's just one quick story of how awesome this is. Jews treated the Old Testament text a bit different than the earliest Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians treated the New Testament. The Old Testament Jews were more careful early on than the Christians were. Does that make sense? The scribal tendencies were more accurate. Of the Jewish text, they had more respect. They counted the words, counted the letters. Early Christians don't seem to have done that as much. Later on in monasteries, they did. The earliest copy of you might say the Old Testament, let's say Isaiah. The earliest copy of Isaiah that we possessed was a Greek translation. It's called the Septuagint. Doesn't matter. I'll tell you later on what it means if you want. The Septuagint, sometimes LXS, because the tradition is that 70 scribes got together and wrote it, that's the tradition. And this was written, let's say, at the 300s, just to keep this real simple.
AD.
Yeah, right. No, wait a second. No, I was going to use a different example. But anyway, the oldest Hebrew version of that came around the year 800. That's right, that's where I was going. 800 AD. So that's the Greek, and that's Hebrew. Well, we know originally it was written in Hebrew with some Aramaic. So 800 AD of a text that might have been written in 500 BC, that's a big gap. But most scholars historically said, but we think it's probably pretty trustworthy. Then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And all the Dead Sea Scrolls were, to some degree, might have come to an abrupt ending. That's all debated. But they stopped cold turkey right before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And we found in these caves, a little shepherd boy was throwing rocks, and he heard a shh. He went to go see what happened, and a pot had broken, and it's full. These caves are full of caches of pots full of scrolls in them. And he goes to sell them and starts ripping them to shreds because he gets more money if he gives them pieces away. Eventually they stop. They go find cave after cave after cave after cave of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of texts, most of which were locally used for their particular probably Essene or Qumran community, but there were Old Testament documents in there as well. So the oldest text 800. So that gets us, let's say, to 100 BC. We have the copy of Isaiah. So overnight, instantaneously, we time traveled. The earliest copy in Hebrew we have was 800 AD, and then when we found Isaiah and other Old Testament texts, we just time traveled almost 1,000 years. You think they're interested in how they did the copying went?
Oh, yeah.
So they took those documents, the Isaiah and Isaiah, they compared an 800 AD manuscript to a 100 BC manuscript, and guess what they found? Almost identical. In 1,000 years of copying, there was very few differences. Now, that's not the same as the Christian manuscripts, but Jews were very, very careful.
Why do you think there's that difference between how Jews treated their copies?
Good question. Why the difference? Probably because there was no formal system set up. The Jews there's a lot of maybe after we can chat about that. When Jews, probably a few reasons. One is because by the time of this time period, 300 BC, the texts, there's so many texts that were already considered sacred scripture that there was a reverence given to them that the earliest Christians did not give to the exact kind of way in the earliest few centuries. That's probably, I wish I could have time to nuance that. They still thought it as sacred and so forth. It probably had some kind of play early into it. Some kind of play. But the second thing is, probably the main reason is, they did not have a system in place of what's called a scriptorium. For example, the Qumran community, if you go to the Dead Sea today, you could find it. I've stood there, I've looked at the scriptorium. They had scribes who sat in this room, and they would they'd read the text aloud, and then, you have 15, 20 people copying the text. And earliest Christian communities did not have that. They would have copied one-on-one, one manuscript with one manuscript by a scribe. And so the system's not in place. And then third, which is related to number two, but since you don't have the same kind of formal training of someone who goes to school to learn how to copy the text of a Jew, earliest Christians did not have that. They might have been scribes, probably they were scribed to write it. They had formal training to maybe do other documents, but for the biblical text, it's just not the same kind of thing. And some may not even been very formal scribes. They might have been people who just be able to copy, who might even be able to read it. And so it's just a little more haphazard. But my last thing I'd say is, we're not exactly sure because we don't know exactly how the earliest copying of the Christian movement happened. We don't have much evidence of exactly how. There's one book I recommended on your handout that talks about, what's it called? Books, Readers and Books.
Larry Hurtado.
No, Larry Hurtado's a great one. Is it Gamble?
Harry Gamble.
Harry Gamble. That's the best work Harry Gamble is the best I've ever read. It's nerdy, but I love it. And it will maybe answer more of your questions as well. It's the best I've ever read on that. But if I had to have one answer, it'd be the main thing I said, which is seems to have been no formal place to go to say, okay, now it's time to copy sacred Christian scripture like they did of the Old Testament. There was no modern Christian scriptorium until the monastery was invented. Then there became one. And said it didn't happen that way. So my point at this stage is, you see those big gaps at the bottom? Those are called lacunae. Those are big fat gaps. It means holes. It's fragments. It's ripped up. Well, what were the words there? We don't know unless you find some other manuscript where there are no holes there. And you start putting them together. Well, when you transcribe it, it looks like this. It looks like this. So, for example, here's a Damascus document that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's the Hebrew, and they'll have it in brackets. But in English, they'll do it this way. Bracket, ... for the SO bracket NS. ... for the Son. And NS means that's where it starts. In Hebrew, if you can't read Hebrew, it makes the NS sound right there. But for the so is conjecture. We don't know what it said because there's a big fat hole in the manuscript. But it might say, for the sons of light to keep apart from the what? The what? Gets us to right there. Then it's a bracket, YSA. Bracket is a human, just like you, who go up to, you become a Hebrew specialist, and you go, I wonder what they meant to say, ways of. It's just a hypothetical conjecture. The bracket is just a hypothetical conjecture. Why is it hypothetical? Because there's a big hole. We don't know what it said. And some, nothing. We have no idea because there's big gaping holes there. ... We don't know. We don't know. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So when you translate to English, and we did all this stuff in our PhD, you have to study and you have to do the best you can. But you don't make arguments based on things in brackets because that's just conjecture. You can say, you can't do like a word study on, I don't know, Josiah, and it shows up in brackets. No, that's just scholar Sue. Sue thought I might say Josiah. You don't know what it said, so you can't make an argument based on that gap. There's a hole. There's a literal hole there. You can't. But we say, it might have said that. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the worst because if we don't have another manuscript that has what it said, we will never know unless we found some document one day. The Old Testament's a little different because we can compare it with other scrolls of Isaiah or other scrolls of whatever and fill in the gaps. Does that make sense? Well, look at the New Testament. If all you had was on the right side, well, that'll help you. Look how much you wouldn't have if that's all you had. But when you compare it to that, we can fill in a whole lot of gaps. And my point at this place is, in the New Testament, there are no major lacunae, except maybe in the Mark, which means there's no document in the New Testament, none, like this Dead Sea Scroll. There's no place in the New Testament where we go, we'll never know. Then Jesus said, get out of it. We'll never know what he said. There's nothing like that in any of the 27 documents we possess. We can fill in the gaps on everything. That's my point.
That's incredible.
Isn't that amazing? But it's not like that with other ancient documents. Dead Sea Scrolls, other Roman literature, Greek literature. Sometimes, look at the literature yourself. You'll see ... That means we'll never know unless we find some other ancient thing that helps us out. Not in the New Testament. Not in the New Testament. There are nothing except maybe the end of Mark. Maybe. And, I was going to get number 6. Let me see how much time. You tell me, you want to finish the last few minutes or be done now and come back? How's your attention span?
Good.
Good. Glad you woke up. I'm just kidding. That's just a joke. I'm kidding. Is it okay or not? Just a few minutes or not? Tell me. It's okay to say no.
Sure. That's okay if you think a few minutes is enough for what you want to do on variants.
Well, at least to start it. At least to start it.
Sounds good.
A variant means when there's a change in the manuscript. You might say the word mistake You can say mistake, but in textual criticism, it's a variant. Whenever there's any difference whatsoever, they can be spotted. There are variants. No manuscript that we possess is the same as another one. None of them. Not identical. If everything was exactly the same besides one, instead of saying can't, it said cannot, that's a variant. If it said there, T-H-E-R-E, versus the possessive T-H-E-I-R, that's a variant. If ever the word, that's a variant. No New Testament manuscript is identical to the other one. Everyone's a variant on every page all the time. They are there. Some people have a real hard time with that because they think God would have made sure that would never have happened. Bart Ehrman's first descent into leaving the faith was because of this issue right here. It's not what did him in, but that's a different. What did him in was evil and suffering, but this is the first thing that got him. He grew up in a fundamentalist home where there were no errors ever. Well, the variants are there. But 99% of them are spelling. And there's tons of them we can list in textual criticism. We study all the different kinds of variants. But they didn't have spell check. There's no Microsoft Word. Didography was common. If you're looking at one and you're going back and forth and back and forth, if you look here and then go over here and then look back quickly, if you look at the line right above it or right below it, you're going to copy those words and then go back to where you're supposed to be. That happened all the time. Homonyms happen all the time, like they're there. They sound the same, but different. That happens all the time. The point is, you can spot them. Specialists spot them immediately and go, oh, that's not what he meant. That's that word. Okay, we'll fix that. He misspelled it. There's no spell check. It doesn't. That's around 99.5. Really, the specialists will tell you it's about 99.5% of all the variants are of that kind that can be spotted and fixed immediately. Oh, I know what you meant. If I look at my son and daughter's literature, I should have brought that. In my office, I got some sweet Valentine notes from Valentine's Day. And some little kid says something about, I love your heart. The letters were backwards, not even spelled right, but took just a few seconds. I know exactly what the person said. If I were to reproduce it, I would do it for fun just as I had it. But if someone said, what did it really say? I can fix it quickly. But it was a big fat jumble of letters. But when you have children, you get to learn how to read scribble. And then mom and dad can do that, or grandma, you know what I'm saying? You spot them. So if I said, I want to clean it up for the next copy, that's easy to do. Well, that's what textual critics do. That's how you have a New Testament. Fewer than 1% are what we call meaningful and viable. That is, they really are. But none of them affect doctrine. Bart Ehrman, who writes and does a lot of lectures about this, makes huge mountains out of molehills. He says it absolutely affects doctrine. You can have that view. You can. He doesn't in his published literature, he does not. But in debates, he likes to say he does. But in his published literature, he'll say there is no major thing that's affected at all. In my view, based on I've looked at all of them, there's about a dozen. There's about 10 or 12 that are meaningful and viable. You go, oh yeah, I see that, but they don't affect doctrine whatsoever. You make up your own mind. If we have time, maybe next time look at Mark 69 and following. That's the ending of Mark. That's the very ending of Mark. Different manuscripts made up endings. Probably made them up. John 7, some of these are big sacred texts. John 7, 53 through 11, that's the woman caught in adultery. Manuscripts do not have that in the ancient documents. Other manuscripts now don't have it in John. That's in John. And some of the major older texts had it in Luke. So it was a floating story that showed up in different manuscripts. And by the time they got locked down into John, then it started being copied in John. That's why I'll never preach from it, ever. I don't think it was original in John. Jesus might have done it, but you read sometimes Bible commentaries, you just skip the story. And in your almost any English translation, there's going to be a little footnote or asterisk or in brackets. It will say, some manuscripts do not have this story. Most people don't look at that. So there's no big secret that someone's trying to trick you. But there's nothing in that story that talks about any kind of doctrine. Jesus says, I admit it, I'm just a dude. I'm not the Son of God. None of that nonsense. Mark 1:1, little things like Mark 1:1. Mark 1:1 begins the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then a lot of translations should, in brackets, put the Son of God. there were manuscripts that don't have the Son of God. So it would say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Other manuscripts said the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I did a whole PhD on that verse. I came to the conclusion it doesn't matter, which made them very frustrated in class. And then I got that part of your paper. Why even do it? That's what the professor said. I said, because you gave me an assignment. I could pick a text. I picked Mark. Who different? Mark makes the point he's the Son of God in many other texts. It is irrelevant if he said it in Mark 1:1. There's no distinction. Anyway, that's a variant. So better translations, better manufacturers will tell you a little footnote. That's it. So here's a chart by Dan Wallace is certainly one of the best textual critics in the world right now. 75% or so are spelling errors. Untranslatable. Tons and tons of difference are translatable. In Greek, you can pay Jesus loves John in like 25 different ways in Greek. They're meaningful but not viable, and meaningful, viable, very small. Meaning they probably were an ancient one, but we're not sure. Mark 1:41, Jesus comes and heals a man with a withered hand. In your translation, I bet you it says, and seeing the man, he felt compassion. But in the good translations that will let you know, should have a footnote that say, some manuscripts don't say felt compassion, but felt anger. That's a meaningful but viable. So depending on how you look at it, many textual critics almost always are going to say the harder reading is probably more probable. And it is probably a harder reading to think Jesus was mad at the guy that he felt compassion. But the scribes didn't like that he was angry, so they changed it to compassion, and that's what stuck. But we have ancient texts that say angry. That's also debated because the words for anger and the word for compassion are spelled pretty similarly. So some say it's just a typo. And others say, no, it really was anger, and they softened it. Well, there we go. That's an example of 141. That's to be a meaningful and viable. Now, is that a major doctrine? I would say absolutely not. We have other evidences where Jesus is mad in the gospel text. And
what was that text again?
Mark 141.
Oh, Mark 141. How does this chart compare with the 99.5% spelling errors?
Okay, that's not spelling. They're not irrelevant, but not meaningful and viable. That's everything else. About 99.98% of 95% of all variants don't matter. They don't matter. They can all be spotted, and that's why I said that early on. They can. There's no mystery like, what if we've missed him? No, anybody in my field, that's what we study. We were forced to learn this. You can spot them quickly, and almost usually the easy good because they're almost always spelling errors. You go, that's not what he meant to say. But then some things aren't even untranslatable. They really are. They might use an article or no article, like the or no the, but in Greek that's not always translated. There's something called a post-positive day. You don't even translate that. There's no English way to translate. You ignore it. Your translation don't even usually have it. But they might be different in the manuscripts. That's called a variant.
Mine says indignant.
Indignant.
Mine says sternly.
Sternly. There you go. I think more of the modern translation might be leaning more towards the anger part because of this kind of stuff. Bart Ehrman and others like him, what's cool is they come and bring up this textual criticism to people, and all of a sudden, people are learning and caring more about textual criticism. The problem, of course, is it sounds like it's cutting edge. And a lot of people, unfortunately, say, therefore he's of the devil. He's introducing all these brand new concepts. They're new if you're not new, if you've never heard of this stuff, sure, but in my field, and y'all have all your own fields, in my field, there's nothing new about this at all. This is standard stuff. We study this all the time. But to the popular level, people don't think about it, and it sounds like it's... Bart will say things like this. Bart will say, there are more mistakes, there are more variants than there are words in the New Testament.
Oh, phooey.
Well, the answer is that's true, but the question is, but what kind of variant is it? Oh, well, they're mostly just spelling errors and untranslatable. Well, then why even say that? Because it gives a shock factor. The point is, I mean, it's a shock factor. There are more mistakes than there are words. And I get it. That'll sell books, and it makes a good lectures. But when you start saying which ones matter at all, he always comes out about a dozen. And I already told you several of them already. And then you get to make your mind whether you think those are big deals. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Christian. I'm saying it because of my work as a historian, textual critic, in a little bit. I do not think at all they affect major doctrine. But that's my view. And most textual critics. We're actually done with that right now. Those are external criteria, the stuff, the manuscripts. So nothing I've said means every single word is true and so forth. What it does mean, though, is it's quite probable that Christianity is talking about events, these ancient documents, that we ought to look at them seriously. They're historical documents, and we have reason to trust them. And if we don't have reason to trust them, we should trust any historical document anywhere, ever.
In the very beginning, they were oral, or transmitted oral from generation to generation. Isn't that true?
Good question. So at the beginning, they were transmitted orally. That's a good question. Brother, what's so interesting about that, it really is, I love how Larry Hurtado says it, the earliest Christians were very bookish. And that's weird because Romans and Greeks and even Jews were a little different. Jews were a little more like Christians. But Greeks and Romans were not so bookish. They liked books. But since most people couldn't read and write, books still mattered. But there was a much more oral tradition involved. But Christians from early on liked their books. Even though most people couldn't read or write, these books became so authoritative so fast, they were foundational documents to the community. So if there's an oral component, and there was an oral component, it was within the first few decades of the Jesus movement, is what we say in scholarship. So after in Jesus' ministry, then his death and resurrection, and the earliest churches form, that's all oral. That's when they're sharing the gospel and proclaiming it over and over and over and over. But immediately, Paul starts writing letters, and they almost immediately begin circulation. We know by the time 2 Peter is written, it alludes to Paul's letters. Now, we don't know which letters he has in mind, but he says the letters of Paul, plural. They can be confusing too, but he lines it up with Scripture. He said Scripture and Paul's letters. So by the end of, when you write 2 Peter, most scholars put 2 Peter on the year 90 AD. So within, Paul probably died in AD 64, 66 at the latest. So within 30 years of his life, you have a document written about Paul's letters at the same level of Scripture, like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. That's fast. That's stinking fast within a few decades. His letters that he almost certainly never intended to be Scripture. Now they're Scripture. They're being read as liturgy in churches, and they're written down and composed. And most scholars think Paul's letters were compiled then quickly into a document of probably 7 letters put together. And there's a long story there, but 7 probably for symbolic reasons. 1 and 2 Corinthians were really counted as 1. 1 and 2 Thessalonians counted as 1. So a 7 collection traveled very quickly together. So oral, yes, first few decades, but bookish, boy, fast. And historically speaking, that's very odd when it comes to any ancient people group. They love their books. And then they created or invented or even just made popular the codices, the codex, like an instruction manual.
God intended all this to be the way it is. I believe he inspired the people involved in the writing, the transmission of the material, the spreading of it, the copying and so forth. The scribes, what they did. God was behind it all. He intended for us to have his word for our benefit, for our learning, for our, all the reasons the Bible is good for. The Bible says what it's
Gotcha.
meant to be. Well, the Bible states what its purpose is.
So you believe that God inspired?
God was behind it all, I believe.
God was behind it all.
It wasn't just happenstance or cultural
Gotcha.
traditions. It was, but God was behind it all. His will was being carried out through all these different processes.
Gotcha. So you believe God's will has been carried out through all these processes. God was behind it all. And just to wrap up on that point, we'll be done. Good. Good. And what a person believes about God's activity behind the scenes or whatever is certainly a faith statement. And Christians historically have had different views on that, which is fine. To piggyback that, to make it clearer to this study, what I'm trying to demonstrate, I'm trying my best to demonstrate is that as we get more and more to Jesus, as it were, you've noticed I've never used the word inspired or inerrant or anything, because when we talk to people who don't believe in it at all, those terms are gibberish to them, and they'll say, well, Mormons say that about there it's inspired. They'll say Muslims say that Quran is inspired. Everyone's is inspired. What difference does it make? And so I don't go there. I just don't. If someone asks me, do you believe it is? I go, well, yeah, but that's a faith statement. And secondly, I'd say is, this is my view, none of your view. I do not think the Bible's trustworthy because I think it's inspired. I don't. A lot of Christians do. I'm saying real quickly, a lot of Christians do. A lot of Christians say, we ask the question, do you trust the Bible? Yeah, I do, because it's inspired. Okay, I don't find that convincing. I think there's a whole host of reasons to find it convincing historically before we get to that point. And that's what I'm trying to demonstrate in the study. It's not that I'm against it. I'm trying to, because I've talked to so many atheists, I'm trying to start where they're at, which is, let's just treat it like history.
But in my simpleton understanding of things, that's where I'm at, because, you know.
Well, it had to be simpleton and all complex. No, I'm just saying, it depends on what kind of person you're talking. If a non-believer is talking to you,
They wouldn't convince them.
they probably don't care if you think it's inspired.
No,
but you can talk to the person, they might go, oh, really? Well, now I'm convinced. That's awesome.
What I believe,
But in my experience,
I
they're
wouldn't
not.
be able to convince anybody.
Gotcha.
Because I don't have the intellect. But,
Well, no, yeah, you do.
You know.
But that's the whole point. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I'm just trying to demonstrate if a non-believer, I personally, doesn't be your way, my person, I don't go, it's inspired. Of course it is. I say, well, let's treat it like we do any ancient text. Are there manuscripts? Is there archaeological evidence? Is there external data? Is there internal data? Like any other religion, it's all fair. It should be all on the same level. Herodotus, Thucydides, Tacitus, New Testament, these are ancient manuscripts. Do they hold up water or not? And I think they do, and that's the point. Anyway, I'll end on that. If you have any questions or comments, we'll afterwards you can chat. Thank you, Lord Jesus, so much for everything that you are for us, and we ask continually for your wisdom to be able to understand all that we can and to remember all that we can, so that when we do hopefully share the hope that is within us, we're able to articulate as much as we can to people, to let them know that Christianity makes sense, and it's not just wishful thinking, it's not a blind faith, but there's reasons to believe it, and they're good ones. But no matter what, of course, Spirit, if we don't have your courage to talk about you, then all this knowledge is worthless. So please help us do that for sure. People we can come encounter with, at work, at home, online, wherever it might be, help us be interested to explain to them these kind of facts. But of course, ultimately, as I prayed many times, we really want them to get to know you, and we're fully cognizant that facts about manuscripts and so forth don't make a person have a relationship with you. So help us get to that. But Lord Jesus, these other things, help us be intrigued to help maybe clear away some of the cobwebs or confusion or misinformation that's out there, and maybe in our own minds and hearts too, that we have a solid foundation, that this is good stuff. So help us feel that security and safety and confidence, knowing that you are behind, in front of the scenes, and guiding that process and guiding us to help understand that truth, since all truth is from you. Further issues, God, that are on our hearts and minds this night, stresses or worries, fears, whatever it might be, please help us give them to you. Spirit, please do your great work. Help us deny our wills and pick up our crosses to follow you, no matter the cost. And help us be the kind of people that when they meet us, they want to get to know you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.